In August 1944, the Third Army covered 400 miles across France in less than a month, the fastest sustained advance by any army in the European War. George S. Patton, benched for a year, buried behind a phantom army, and operational for barely 2 weeks when Bradley shut him down at Argentan. He didn't wait. Within 48 hours, he'd pivoted 3 corps onto separate axes aimed at the Seine, and the whole machine lurched east at a pace no one on either side had planned for. Patton's tanks outran their own supply trucks. His infantry swam rivers because the engineers couldn't keep up. The fighter bombers flew hour-long shifts over columns moving so fast that targets marked on morning maps were 20 miles behind friendly lines by afternoon. 400 miles, 6 rivers, 3 Army Corps fanned across a front wider than some countries. And on September 2, 1944, every tank, every truck, every half-track in the Third Army ran dry, 60 miles from the German border. If you find stories like this worth your time, take a moment to subscribe and hit the bell. We have much more coming for you. Your support is what keeps us moving forward. On August 13, 1944, Bradley's stop order froze 55th Corps at Argentan. The Falaise pocket hadn't closed. Tens of thousands of German troops were still grinding east through a shrinking corridor, and the Canadians pushing south from Caen hadn't linked up with the Americans coming north. Patton's lead corps sat 15 miles short of the meeting point, under orders not to move. By August 15th, he'd pulled Haislip's 15th Corps off the Argentan line and aimed it northeast, not toward the pocket, but past it, toward the Seine. The shorter envelopment hadn't worked. He'd take the longer one. On 3 separate axes, he redirected the entire army eastward. Haislip's 15th Corps would swing through Dreux to Mantes-Gassicourt, 40 miles northwest of Paris, and get across the Seine first. Walker's 6th Corps, the 7th Armored and 5th Infantry Divisions, would drive east through Chartres toward the crossings at Melun and Montereau, south of the capital. And Eddy's WWII Corps, freshly under new command after Gilbert Cook's health collapsed mid-campaign, would hold at Orléans until fuel allowed, then punch east to Sens and Troyes. The scale of what Patton was attempting deserves a moment of arithmetic. The Third Army's front, once all 3 corps were fanned out, would stretch from Mantes-Gassicourt in the north, 40 miles beyond Paris, all the way down to the Loire Valley in the south. That's a span wider than the entire Normandy beachhead. A normal army would have covered half that distance and still worried about its flanks. Patton was covering it with fewer than a dozen divisions, most of them moving at maximum speed in one direction and barely looking sideways. Every mile east made the flanks thinner, and while he was pushing his 3 corps toward the Seine, one of his own division commanders nearly derailed the operation on day 1. On August 15th, the same day the wider envelopment kicked off, Major General Philippe Leclerc, commanding the French 2nd Armored Division under Haislip's 15th Corps, stormed into Patton's headquarters and declared that if he wasn't allowed to advance on Paris, he'd resign. Patton needed Leclerc's tanks heading east toward the Seine, not peeling off toward the capital on a political errand. Patton wrote in his diary that he told Leclerc in his best French that Leclerc was acting like a baby and that he'd put him in the most dangerous position on the front, which ought to be enough for any soldier. They parted on civil terms. Leclerc stayed on the line. The French 2nd Armored fell in with the rest of 15th Corps and pushed east toward Dreux, Paris left behind. For the moment. Now here's where Patton did something that most generals in his position wouldn't have done. On August 14th, after his daily staff conference, he'd stood up and given a short talk. The Third Army had been operational for exactly 14 days. In those 2 weeks, his divisions had ripped through Brittany, swung south to the Loire, pivoted north to Argentan, and were now fanning east across a front that stretched hundreds of miles. And Patton, standing in front of his officers, said it flat. The Third Army had advanced further and faster than any army in the history of the war. And if you think about what he'd just come through, the nerve of that moment is hard to overstate. 48 hours earlier, his own army group commander had told him to stop. The Falaise encirclement, the single biggest chance to trap the German army in the west, had slipped because the jaws didn't close and plenty of people were already pointing fingers at the Argentan halt. A cautious general would have spent the next week in damage control arguing about who lost the pocket. Patton spent it launching the fastest pursuit the European theater had seen. We tend to look at decisions like this and see simple aggressiveness, a man who moved fast because sitting still made his skin crawl. The reality was colder. Patton had read the battlefield, and what he saw was an enemy that wasn't retreating in good order. The German army west of the Seine was running. Shattered divisions, vehicles burning on every road. German headquarters were packing up and fleeing east. Army Group B's own command post at the Château de la Roche-Guyon, perched on the Seine downstream from Mantes, would soon be within range of American artillery. New German divisions arriving from the Bay of Biscay, elements of the German First Army under General Kurt von der Chevalerie, were coming up piecemeal, disorganized, without cohesion, and a running, fragmenting enemy doesn't give you time to plan a clean operation and wait for the other jaw to arrive. It gives you one window: run faster. The moment you pause to consolidate, to resupply, to sort out who owns which road, the enemy finds a river, digs in behind it, and you're back to grinding for every mile. Patton's pivot after Argentan wasn't recklessness. It was a cold read of one fact: the door was open, and it wouldn't stay open. The instrument that made the speed possible wasn't just tanks, it was air. Brigadier General Otto Weyland's 19th Tactical Air Command had set up shop right next to Patton's headquarters, close enough that the two staffs coordinated in minutes, not hours. Weyland's P-47 Thunderbolts flew in one-hour rotations over the armored columns, 4 aircraft per shift, with 4 more sitting on ground alert, ready to scramble. Inside the lead tanks, air liaison officers carried VHF radios tuned directly to the fighter-bomber frequency. When a column hit a defended crossroads, an anti-tank position, a bridge the Germans were rigging to blow, the tank officer called it in. 3 minutes later, Thunderbolts were rolling in with 500-pound bombs, and Weyland wasn't just flying close support. The Third Army's southern flank, that long exposed edge running from the Loire all the way east to wherever Toy-the-Corps happened to be on any given day, was wide open. Patton didn't have the divisions to cover it on the ground, so Weyland covered it from the air, running armed reconnaissance sweeps along the Loire Valley, hammering any German column that tried to push north into Patton's side. In August alone, 19I, TAC flew over 12,000 sorties, close support, interdiction, counter-air, reconnaissance, averaging more than 400 a day. The pace of the air war matched the pace of the ground war because Weyland had built his command to do exactly that: move when Patton moved, hit what Patton couldn't reach, screen what Patton couldn't cover. By August 16th, the machine was in full motion. Dreux fell, Orléans fell, and Chartres was turning into a real fight. The 7th Armored Division's Combat Command B had hit the city on the 15th and been thrown back. The defenders included veterans of the 352nd Infantry Division, the same outfit that had fought the Americans at Omaha Beach, reinforced by the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. Walker brought up the 5th Infantry Division to reinforce the armor, and the two divisions ground into the city side by side. It would take until August 18th to crack it open. On August 16th, while Walker's divisions were still fighting inside Chartres, Bradley issued a second stop order. This time, the problem was logistics. Third Army was consuming hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel a day, burning through ammunition faster than the supply system could push it forward, and Bradley was staring at the growing gap between Patton's northern shoulder and the rest of First Army. For 24 hours, everything froze. Patton couldn't advance, but he didn't waste the pause. He used it to reposition Walker's forces, shifting the 7th Armored from Chartres to Dreux for flank screening duty and clearing the 5th Infantry Division to finish the city fight. By August 17th, Bradley partially relented. 15th Corps could continue to Mantes on the Seine. Mantes-Gassicourt could resume its eastward push. Within hours, Haislip's lead regiment was on the road to Mantes, and Walker had the 5th Infantry closing on Chartres from the west. Chartres fell on August 18th after 3 days of street fighting. The 352nd Infantry Division's rearguard pulled back overnight, and by morning Walker had already reoriented XX Corps eastward. The 5th Infantry Division aimed at the Seine crossings at Melun and Montereau, 60 miles ahead, with the 7th Armored screening the Corps' northern flank from Dreux. Patton hadn't waited for Chartres to fall before planning the next move. His orders to Walker were already written: get across the Seine south of Paris, establish bridgeheads, and keep pushing east. 40 miles to the north, Haislip's 15th Corps was closing on Mantes-Gassicourt, a small town on the western bank of the Seine where the river ran about 500 feet wide. Patton wanted a bridgehead across that river before anyone at Chafe had time to issue another stop order, and Haislip understood the urgency. On the evening of August 19th, Haislip picked up the phone and called Major General Iraweish, commanding the 79th Infantry Division. The time was 21:35. The order was simple and immediate: get your men across the Seine tonight. Weich had no bridge. The Germans had blown the road crossings days earlier. What Weich's reconnaissance teams had found was a hydroelectric dam at Mantes, and running across the top of that dam was a concrete service walkway, narrow, fully exposed, wide enough for men in single file, and nothing else. No vehicles could cross it. No heavy weapons could be hauled over it. The only thing that walkway could carry was infantrymen with rifles and whatever ammunition they could stuff into their pockets. The 313th Infantry Regiment drew the assignment. Lieutenant Colonel Sterling Wood organized a patrol from his battalion, and sometime after midnight on August 20th, those soldiers stepped onto the dam walkway and started across. 500 feet of open concrete over black water. The eastern bank was held by German troops whose strength and positions Weicha couldn't confirm. His intelligence was hours old at best. If the Germans had a single machine gun crew covering that dam, the men on the walkway had nowhere to go. No cover on the concrete, no room to maneuver in single file, no way to retreat faster than the man behind you could turn around. Wood's patrol crossed the entire span without drawing fire. The Germans either didn't see them or didn't have forces positioned to cover the dam. Wood's men reached the far bank and fanned out into the darkness along the eastern shore. Behind them, engineers from the 79th Division hauled assault boats to the river's edge and began ferrying the rest of the 313th across in small loads. By dawn on August 20th, the 79th Infantry Division had a foothold on the eastern bank of the Seine, the first Allied bridgehead across the river, established days ahead of Montgomery's planned crossing further north in the British sector. Haislip's reaction, recorded in 15th Corps after-action records, captured the night in 5 words: "What we did last night was a Lulu." Now here's what that crossing looked like from the bottom of the command chain, because the operational summaries don't capture it. For Patton, at his headquarters, speed was a strategic calculation. Get across the river before the enemy reorganizes. For Haislip, speed meant a phone call at 9:30 at night, ordering a river crossing by morning. For Weicha, it meant sending scouts to find a dam and hoping the walkway on top of it could hold men's weight. And for the infantrymen of the 313th, speed meant walking single file across 500 feet of concrete in the dark, knowing that if the Germans had one crew with a belt-fed weapon at the far end, every man on that walkway would go into the river. The further down the command chain Patton's tempo traveled, the narrower the margin got between operational success and a catastrophe that would have ended careers and filled hospitals. Holding that bridgehead was almost as dangerous as taking it. The 79th Division spent the next 3 days fighting off German counterattacks from units trying to hold open the crossing corridors for their own retreating forces. Every German soldier still west of the Seine needed to get east, and the American bridgehead at Mantes sat directly across one of their escape routes. The 79th's infantry dug in on the eastern bank and held, while engineers worked around the clock to construct a vehicle bridge capable of carrying tanks and trucks across the river. Until that bridge was up, everything on the eastern bank, every rifleman, every mortar round, every meal, had to come across by assault boat or over the dam walkway. The bridgehead held, and by August 23rd, the engineers had the bridge operational, opening the floodgate for Haislip to push armor across. From that bridgehead, the 79th Division pushed out fast to expand the foothold before German reserves could mount a coordinated defense. On August 22nd, a task force from the 313th Infantry under Lieutenant Colonel Van Ribber drove south along the eastern bank toward La Roche-Guyon. The chateau perched on chalk cliffs above the river that had served as Field Marshal Rommel's Army Group B headquarters since late 1943. Rommel was gone, critically wounded by a strafing attack on July 17th, and the headquarters staff had already packed up and fled east ahead of the American advance. Van Ribber's patrol pushed through to the approaches of the chateau compound and found the buildings largely emptied. Maps, communications equipment, personal effects, all removed. German troops still held the high ground on the cliffs above the river, and the task force pulled back under small arms fire rather than commit to a pitched fight over a building with no military value beyond its history. American infantrymen had walked through the hallways where Rommel's staff had planned the defense of Normandy, barely 10 weeks after D-Day. German troops on the surrounding cliffs reoccupied the high ground after Van Ribber withdrew, and the chateau wouldn't fall to Allied hands for another week. While the 79th was expanding its bridgehead at Mantes, Patton was losing a third of his striking power to politics. The Paris question that Leclerc had raised on August 15th had climbed all the way to Eisenhower. De Gaulle was pressuring the Supreme Commander directly. The French resistance inside Paris had launched a premature uprising on August 19th, and if the Allies didn't move quickly, the Germans might crush the insurgents or carry out standing demolition orders on the city's bridges and infrastructure. By August 22nd, Eisenhower made the call. Paris would be liberated, and Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division would lead the entry. Patton's problem was operational. Leclerc belonged to Haislip's 15th Corps, and pulling the division meant stripping Haislip of his primary armored exploitation force at exactly the moment the Seine bridgehead needed to be driven east. The 2nd Armored peeled away from 15th Corps on August 23rd, taking with it over 150 Sherman tanks, dozens of self-propelled guns, and the thousands of support troops that kept an armored division functioning. Haislip was left to exploit his Seine bridgehead with the 79th Infantry Division, the 2nd Infantry Division, and whatever corps artillery he could move across the river, a fraction of the mobile striking power he'd had 48 hours earlier. 2 days later, Leclerc entered Paris to rapturous crowds. Patton was left with 2 corps to carry the advance that 3 had been assigned to execute. Patton pushed Walker and Eddy harder. If the arithmetic didn't work on paper, 2 corps covering 3 corps' frontage, Patton's calculation was that the German defense ahead of him was too shattered to exploit the gap. The enemy was running, not counterattacking. Walker's X-Dex Corps reached the Seine south of Paris during the last week of August. Two crossings mattered: Melun, a mid-sized town 15 miles southeast of Paris where the river curved through open ground, and Montereau, 20 miles further south, where the Seine met the Yonne River at a confluence guarded by high ground on the eastern bank. Both crossings were defended by elements of the German 59th Panzer Grenadier Brigade, not a first-line formation, but armed with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons, dug in on the commanding terrain east of the river with clear fields of fire down to the water. At Montereau, the 5th Infantry Division's scouts had worked the riverbank for days ahead of the main body, mapping the current, measuring the depth, looking for any spot where the water was shallow enough to wade. They found a gravel bar near the Montereau bridge site where the river ran waist-deep at its shallowest, not marked on any military map, just a quirk of the riverbed that scouts on the ground could find, and headquarters staffs couldn't. Before dawn on August 24th, 2 battalions of the 5th Infantry stripped their heavy packs, waterproofed their ammunition, slung their rifles high across their chests, and went into the water. Waist-deep on the gravel bar, chest-deep where the bottom dropped off, the current pulling at their legs. They crossed in the half-light, scrambled up the muddy eastern bank, and hit the German positions on the high ground before the defenders had fully registered what was happening. The 59th Panzer Grenadier Brigade's troops on the bluffs above the river poured machine gun and mortar fire down on the crossing site once they realized what was happening, but the 5th Infantry's lead companies were already up the bank and working through the first line of foxholes. By mid-morning, the 2 battalions had cleared the immediate bluffs east of Montereau and were digging in to hold the ground against the inevitable counterattack. German mortars hammered the crossing point all day, trying to cut the thin stream of reinforcements and ammunition still wading across the gravel bar. The 5th Infantry held. Engineers began working on a bridge to get vehicles across, but until it was finished, and it wouldn't be for another 36 hours, everything the division needed on the eastern bank had to come over on foot or by boat. 15 miles upstream at Melun, the crossing went harder. The 7th Armored Division's lead elements tried to rush a partially intact bridge on August 23rd and ran straight into prepared defenses. The Germans had the bridge approaches registered with interlocking machine gun fire and at least 2 anti-tank guns covering the road surface. The first attempt cost vehicles and men. Walker came forward personally. The XX Corps commander moved to the crossing site and positioned himself at the river's edge, exposed to the same rifle and machine gun fire that had stopped his armor. Walker spent the better part of that afternoon on the bank, reorganizing assault teams, redirecting engineers to secondary crossing points, coordinating supporting fire from tanks on the western shore. Members of Walker's staff took wounds around him. An aide was hit. Walker stayed on the bank until his infantry had assault boats in the water and troops moving across under covering fire from the western side. The crossing at Melun went through by stages. First infantry in assault boats under covering fire from tanks positioned on the western bank. Then engineers launching a treadway pontoon bridge across the river while mortar rounds dropped into the water on either side of the construction site. The bridge crew worked through the night of August 23rd, and by dawn, the spans were linked and carrying armor across. XX Corps now had footholds east of the Seine at both Melun and Montereau. The next morning, August 25th, the Montereau crossing produced one of the war's less publicized acts of extraordinary courage. Private Harold Garman, a medic with the 5th Medical Battalion attached to the 5th Infantry Division, was helping evacuate wounded soldiers across the river in a small boat. The boat was in the middle of the Seine when German machine guns opened fire from the eastern bank, rounds snapping into the water around the hull, punching through the thin sides. The wounded men inside couldn't move. Garman jumped overboard into the current, grabbed the gunwale and started swimming, not toward cover on the near bank, but forward toward the fire, dragging the shot-up boat and its passengers through the machine-gun-beaten zone to the eastern shore, where other soldiers could pull the wounded to safety. Garman got the boat across. Every wounded man in it survived. The Army awarded Garman the Medal of Honor for those minutes in the water. And if you step back from the operational narrative for a moment, what happened between Patton's headquarters and a medic's hands is worth sitting with. Patton gave an order: keep moving east. That order traveled down through corps, division, regiment, battalion, company, and at the very bottom of that chain, it became a 19-year-old private swimming through gunfire to drag a sinking boat full of men who couldn't help themselves. The will of a commanding general, by the time it reaches the person actually doing the work, doesn't look like strategy. It looks like a body in the water. The pace was producing its own kind of tactical disorder behind the forward units. XX Corps' columns had pushed so fast that no secure rear area existed. German units, shattered divisions, headquarters that had lost contact with their commands, armed stragglers moving east on foot were scattered across the French countryside behind American lines. At night, regimental command posts routinely found themselves surrounded by Germans who'd been bypassed in daylight. According to the XX Corps after-action records, the troops developed their own field solution, the corral. When a regiment halted for the night, the infantry dug in facing outward in a circular perimeter, rifles and automatic weapons covering every approach. With the artillery batteries positioned in the center of the ring, tubes depressed to near horizontal for direct fire, ready to rotate 360 degrees and engage targets at point-blank range if Germans stumbled into the perimeter. It was a frontier wagon circle in 20th century France, born from the operational reality that when your advance outruns your ability to clear ground, the enemy ends up behind you as often as in front. According to the XX Corps records, some units fought off 2 or 3 probing attacks per night from groups of 20 to 50 Germans trying to find a way east through the American positions. The front line had ceased to exist in any traditional sense. The entire zone between the Normandy coast and the Seine was a patchwork of American columns moving east and German remnants moving in every direction. By late August, Walker had bridgeheads across the Seine at Melun, Montereau, and Fontainebleau, and his forward elements were already crossing the Yonne and pushing toward the Marne. And to the south, the last piece of Patton's machine was finally running. Eddy's 13th Corps had been sitting at Orléans since mid-August, held in place by Patton's own decision. Third Army didn't have enough fuel to run 3 corps at full speed simultaneously, so Patton had made a cold allocation. Spend the available gasoline on Haislip's Seine crossing and Walker's Chartres to Melun push, and keep Eddy in reserve until the numbers improved. On August 20th, Patton turned Eddy loose. The 4th Armored Division, 13th Corps' main striking arm, commanded by Major General John Shirley Wood, one of the most relentless armored commanders in the European theater, burst east from Orléans on a 2-pronged axis. Combat Command A covered 60 miles to Seine in a single day, seized the bridges over the Yonne River before the German demolition teams could fire their charges, and kept going without pausing to consolidate. By August 22nd, CCA had taken Troyes, 100 miles east of Orléans. Wood's method was simple and brutal. His combat commands leapfrogged each other, one punching through resistance while the other swung around the flank and kept rolling east. When CCA bogged down at a defended town, CCB bypassed it and grabbed the next bridge before the Germans could wire it for demolition. When CCB hit a strong point, CCA was already past it and moving to the next objective. The 4th Armored's tank crews were eating their rations cold in their vehicles, sleeping in shifts inside their Shermans, refusing to stop for anything short of an empty fuel tank. The 35th Infantry Division marched behind the armor, screening the enormous southern flank that stretched all the way back to the Loire, a flank so long that Weyland's 19th TAC was still providing the primary coverage from the air. Wood's 4th Armored was moving so fast that it was capturing German supplies before the retreating enemy could destroy them. At Chalon-sur-Marne, the division's forward units overran a German fuel depot and seized roughly 100,000 gallons of gasoline, fuel that Patton's own supply system couldn't deliver fast enough to keep up with the advance. And the supply picture was getting worse by the day. Third Army's G4 section, the logistics staff, was sending reports to Patton's Chief of Staff, Hobart Gay, that painted an increasingly stark picture. Fuel deliveries from the Normandy depots were falling behind consumption rates, and the gap was widening as the Army pushed further east. The Red Ball Express, the round-the-clock truck convoy system that COMZ had set up to move supplies from the beaches to the front, was itself burning enormous quantities of fuel just to make the runs, and every mile the Army advanced added more distance to every round trip. Gay noted in the Third Army War Diary, with characteristic understatement, a small bit of anxiety for the time. Patton's own diary entries from late August show a man who understood the math perfectly well and chose to ignore its implications. He recorded his fuel shortages in the same breath as his advance mileage, 50 miles gained here, 20,000 gallons short there, as though the two facts belonged to different conversations. When Bradley visited Patton's headquarters on August 28th to discuss the supply crisis face-to-face, Bradley gave Patton conditional authority to push on to the Meuse. If you can do it on what you've got. Patton didn't hear a condition. He heard permission. By that evening, Walker had orders to take Verdun, and Eddy had orders to cross the Meuse at Commercy and Saint-Mihiel, 200 miles east of where Third Army had started the month. Walker's Dectiix Corps covered the 60 miles from the Seine to the Meuse in 3 days. The 7th Armored Division led the push, rolling east through the Champagne country on roads that the retreating Germans hadn't had time to crater or mine properly. Resistance came in scattered bursts, a roadblock manned by a platoon-strength rearguard, a blown culvert over a stream, a single anti-tank gun covering a crossroads that fired 2 or 3 rounds and pulled back before American armor could deploy against it. The German army east of the Seine wasn't fighting a coherent defense. It was trying to get back behind the West Wall, the Siegfried Line fortifications along the German border, before the Americans could catch it in the open. On August 30th, Walker's lead armor reached the Meuse River at Verdun, the same ground where French and German armies had fought for 10 months in 1916, grinding each other down in the worst positional battle of the First World War. 28 years later, the reconnaissance troops of the 7th Armored found the bridges standing. The German demolition teams hadn't had time, or hadn't received orders, to destroy them. Walker's tanks rolled across the Meuse at Verdun without firing a shot at the crossing. On the eastern bank, the 7th Armored's scouts found the roads clear, no prepared positions, no minefields, no anti-tank ditches. The German forces that should have been holding the Meuse line simply weren't there. Downstream, the 5th Infantry Division crossed the Meuse near Dun-sur-Meuse on the same day, wading across at a shallow point and securing the eastern bank while engineers brought up bridging equipment. Walker now had 2 footholds east of the Meuse, 1 armored and 1 infantry, and Patton immediately ordered him to push reconnaissance elements east toward Metz and the Moselle River, the next water barrier before the German border. To the south, Eddy's 20th Corps hit the Meuse on the same day. The 4th Armored Division, still running on a mix of American supply allocations and fuel captured from German depots along the route, reached the river at Commercy on August 31st. Combat Command A seized the bridge intact, pushed armor across, and established a bridgehead on the eastern bank before any organized German force could contest the crossing. Further south, the 80th Infantry Division crossed the Meuse at Saint-Mihiel, the town where General John J. Pershing's American Expeditionary Force had fought its first independent offensive in September 1918. Patton had been there, not as a distant observer, but as a 22-year-old lieutenant colonel commanding the 304th Tank Brigade in that battle, leading French-built Renault tanks into action for the first time in American military history. He'd been wounded at the Meuse-Argonne a week later, shot through the leg while leading tanks on foot. 26 years after, Patton's army was crossing the Meuse at Saint-Mihiel again, headed east toward the same enemy, on the same roads he'd walked as a young man, with a hole in his thigh and a conviction that tanks would change warfare forever. By the end of August 31st, Patton had bridgeheads across the Meuse at Verdun, Commercy, and Saint-Mihiel. In the span of roughly 2.5 weeks, the Third Army had crossed the Seine, the Marne, and the Meuse, three of the great river barriers of northern France, and was sitting less than 60 miles from the German border. The West Wall fortifications, which would later cost the Allies months of casualties to breach, were at that moment largely unmanned. The garrison troops and replacement units that would fill those bunkers in October and November hadn't arrived yet. The concrete was there. The guns were there. The soldiers to man them were not. For a narrow window at the end of August 1944, the door to Germany was open, and then the fuel stopped coming. The collapse didn't arrive as a single dramatic event. It came in a cascade of small failures over September 1st and 2nd. On September 1st, Third Army received fewer than 30,000 gallons of fuel against a daily requirement that Gay's staff estimated at nearly 400,000. Individual tank platoons radioed their battalions. Tanks dry, can't move. Battalions reported to regiments, regiments reported to divisions. Patton ordered his units to drain fuel from any vehicle that wasn't essential to combat. Headquarters trucks, supply wagons, anything with a full or half-full tank, and transfer it to the tanks and armored cars at the front. The measure bought hours, not days. By the morning of September 2nd, the situation reports flowing into Third Army headquarters from every corps, every division, every combat command contained the same two words: immobile formations. The Army's clinical term for a unit that couldn't move because its fuel tanks were empty. Patton's Third Army, the force that had covered 400 miles of France in less than a month, crossed 6 rivers, liberated dozens of cities, destroyed or scattered the better part of 2 German field armies, was parked on the side of the road. Every tank, every half-track, every truck, every jeep, motionless. Not because the Germans had stopped them, not because a river was too wide or a defense too strong, because the gasoline was gone. And if you think about what that meant in military terms, the numbers tell a story that no amount of Patton's fury could overwrite. The Third Army supply lines now stretched back over 300 miles to the Normandy beaches. Every gallon of fuel that reached the front had to be trucked that distance, and the trucks burned fuel doing it. The Red Ball Express was consuming nearly as much gasoline delivering supplies as the combat units were consuming using them. It was a closed loop heading towards zero, and no amount of aggressive driving or captured German depots could change the underlying arithmetic. The supply line's breaking point wasn't a place on the map. It was a ratio, consumption over delivery. When the ratio crossed 1, the Army stopped. Patton could outthink German generals. He could outpace German divisions. He could push his own men past limits that peacetime training manuals said were impossible. What he couldn't do was suspend the relationship between distance and fuel consumption. Logistics isn't an opponent you can outmaneuver. It's physics. Patton raged. He sent messages to Bradley demanding fuel priority over every other army on the Western Front. He argued that one more week of full supply would put the Third Army across the Rhine and into the industrial Saar region. He pointed out, correctly, that the West Wall was unmanned, and that prisoner interrogations confirmed the German army in the West had fewer than 100 operational tanks between the Meuse and the Rhine. Bradley sympathized. Eisenhower had already made a different decision. The Supreme Commander was committing the bulk of the available fuel and transport to Montgomery's 21st Army Group for Operation Market Garden. The airborne and armor thrust through Holland aimed at crossing the Rhine at Arnhem. Patton's Third Army would receive a maintenance allocation, enough fuel to hold its positions and conduct local patrols, nowhere near enough to sustain an advance of any kind. Patton wrote in his diary that he could have been across the Rhine in days if he'd been given the fuel. Whether he was right remains one of the most debated counterfactuals of the European war. On September 2, 1944, the fastest sustained advance of the European war came to a full stop. The Third Army's vehicle tracks, tank treads, truck tires, jeep wheels, ran in an unbroken line from the Norman hedgerows to the Meuse River Valley, 400 miles of French soil, marked by the passage of an army that had moved faster than its own country could feed it. 60 miles to the east, the West Wall sat empty. German garrison troops were still being trucked in from training depots across the Reich. Replacement infantry units hadn't arrived. Artillery positions lacked ammunition. The fortifications that would cost the Allies tens of thousands of casualties to breach in the winter of 1944 and 45 were, at that moment, concrete shells waiting for someone to fill them. Within 6 weeks, someone would. Market Garden, the operation that Eisenhower had prioritized over Patton's eastward push, launched on September 17th. It failed. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped at Arnhem to seize the bridge over the Rhine and was destroyed as a fighting force. Fewer than 2,400 of the original 10,000 paratroopers made it back to Allied lines. The armored relief column couldn't reach them through 60 miles of narrow Dutch roads and determined German resistance. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The fuel and transport that had been diverted from Third Army to support the northern thrust produced no breakthrough, no Rhine crossing, no shortcut into the German heartland. And 60 miles south of the German border, Patton's formations sat exactly where they'd stopped on September 2nd, still listed as immobile in the daily situation reports, parked on ground they'd seized 3 weeks earlier at 20 miles a day. Patton had spent 1944 converting every setback into forward motion. A year of professional exile turned into preparation. The Argentan stop order turned into a wider envelopment that covered more ground than the original plan. The loss of 15th Corps to the Paris liberation, absorbed without slowing down. Every restriction, every political interference, every hesitation from above. Patton had taken each one and squeezed momentum out of it. The one thing he couldn't squeeze momentum from was the 300 miles of French road between his fuel tanks and the supply depots on the Normandy beaches. That distance grew with every mile he advanced, and no amount of will, fury, or operational brilliance could make a truck drive 300 miles on 100 miles worth of gasoline. Patton had outrun everything in August: the Germans, Bradley's caution, Montgomery's timetable, his own logistician's projections. The only thing he couldn't outrun was the math. By October, the West Wall was no longer empty. Fresh German infantry divisions, Volksgrenadier units pulled from training depots, replacement battalions scraped together from rear area commands, filled the bunkers along the Siegfried Line. Anti-tank guns covered the approaches. Artillery batteries, newly supplied, registered their fire on the roads that Patton's reconnaissance elements had driven down unopposed in late August. The fortification line that Patton's tanks could have reached with a few more days of fuel became a killing ground that consumed American divisions through the autumn and into the winter of 1944. Patton's next full-speed operation came in December, the relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, when he wheeled the Third Army 90 degrees in 48 hours, pulled the 4th Armored Division off its positions, and drove 100 miles through snow and ice to break through to the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne. The speed was the same. The direction was west, back across ground he'd already taken in August, plugging a hole in the Allied line that might never have existed if the Germans hadn't been given 4 months to rebuild. Patton finally crossed the Rhine on March 22, 1945, 7 months after his army had run dry on the Meuse. The war in Europe ended 6 weeks later, 400 miles in August, then 7 months to cover the last 60.